They were the boots on the ground that turned the tide and defeated ISIS. But after a Sunday phone call between the US and Turkish presidents, Donald Trump has announced the end of Washington's military backing for Syria's Kurds. It opens the door for Ankara to launch an invasion, perhaps, after Ukraine. Maybe one of our panelists has an insight as to the transcript of this latest phone call. It's a stunning turn of events, one that's paved the way for a visit to the White House in the coming weeks by the Turkish leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. What happened to the fraught relations between the NATO allies, the threats of sanctions over Erdogan's purchase of Russian anti-aircraft missiles? And what's next for Syria's Kurds, who've enjoyed U.S. military support, as well as the jihadist prisoners they hold? What impact on the standing of the U.S. and all Western allies in the coalition to defeat ISIS? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Trump's about-face on Syria. And joining us from Washington, he's a former U.S. intelligence advisor to Iraqi Kurdish forces, Michael Pregent, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute think tank. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
From Istanbul, Talha Köse, associate professor at İmhaldun University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Annick Cizel, senior lecturer at the Paris Sorbonne Nouvelle University. Welcome. And welcome back to Julien Théron, lecturer at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po.
Hi, François.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, Washington woke up to the news this Monday with Republican Senator Lindsey Graham leading some on his side of the aisle to denounce the decision, calling it a disaster, and saying it's just a matter of time before China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea act out in dangerous ways. He's warning of bipartisan motion in the Senate to thwart the U.S. president, but Donald Trump standing firm with a whole new series of tweets this Monday. Wassim Cornet has more.
Doubling down on a controversial move, Donald Trump launched a tweet storm Monday morning, furiously explaining his decision to pull U.S. troops out of northern Syria.
It is time for us to get out of these ridiculous, endless wars. We will fight where it is to our benefit and only fight to win.
Trump's announcement has caused shock and alarm among Kurdish forces who were considered as allies by the United States, with a spokesman even calling the move a stab in the back. U.S. defense officials had tried to block the withdrawal, offering Turkey a plan to create a common safe zone on the border. But President Erdogan, exasperated by Washington's failure to act, is sending troops to the area.
We finished our preparations, completed our operation plans, and gave the necessary orders.
And the U.S. has chosen not to stand in his way. President Erdogan sees Syria's Kurdish forces as an offshoot of Turkey's own Kurdish insurgent group, the PKK, which has fought the Turkish state for decades. Ankara wants to create a 30-kilometer-wide buffer zone between the Turkish border and Syrian territory controlled by the YPG militia. Experts worry that will create a vacuum that would potentially allow for terrorist groups, including the IS group, to gain ground once again. The extremist organization was defeated in Syria earlier this year, but sleeper cells have continued to launch attacks across the region.
Michael Pregent, we've been here before with Donald Trump announcing a pullout from Syria and then reversing himself. He looks serious, though, this time.
I think everyone's taking him seriously this time. Last time it resulted in General Mattis resigning from the Defense Department as Secretary of Defense. And our allies sure believe that this time it's different. And you can see the video. You just showed American troops leaving positions. And this goes on the heels of doing these joint patrols with the Turkish military, where we had the YPG take down defensive positions. But we also made the promise that we'd be there with them. And now, Sunday night, the president decides to do this. It's a shock to the Department of Defense. It's a shock to the Department of State. And it's definitely a shock to our allies, but not a surprise to our allies. There have been these recent examples of betrayal from the Kurdish Peshmerga in Iraq. The YPG have long since felt that this was coming. They are hedging their bets, leveraging their positions. But the language out of the EU, France and Germany is very strong. You cannot attack the YPG, But they also said the same thing of Assad. You can't use barrel bombs on your civilians. You can't use sarin gas on your civilians. You can't use chlorine on your civilians. Now, hopefully there's a difference between Assad and Erdogan. I believe there is. Erdogan should be more cautious in what he does in northern Syria that would lead to what Lindsey Graham said, more sanctions. Now the president, in a confusing statement, says that if Erdogan goes after any Kurdish ally in northern Syria, that will punish the Turkish economy. What did he think they were going to do?
So we have these contradictory statements coming out from, on the one hand, the Defense Department, on the other hand, the State Department. So you have the Defense Department in the past couple of hours saying that it made clear to Turkey, as did the president, that we do not endorse a Turkish operation in northern Syria. But the U.S. State Department saying, one senior official telling reporters that the U.S. expects Turkey to take over captive ISIS fighters if Ankara's incursion seizes area where jailed jihadists are held. So in other words, the U.S. State Department is going under the assumption that Turkey will invade?
Yeah, Turkey's saying that they're going to conduct a military option against terrorists. They're not talking about Jabhat al-Nusra. They're not talking about ISIS. They're talking about the YPG. And every side has played releasing ISIS fighters to create instability as a bargaining chip.
But is the State Department and the Defense Department singing from the same page here? It looks like the Defense Department's not saying the same thing as the State Department.
No, they're not. No, not at all. Not at all. No, they're not.
And so what does that mean? What's going on in Washington?
The White House decided, without talking to DOD, is what it looks like, and the White House decided without telling or without listening to the warnings coming from the State Department that this would greenlight what Erdogan wants to do. This isn't simply about Erdogan and the Turkish military moving into northern Syria to secure ISIS captive fighters. He wants to move in, negate the threat from the YPG, and resettle Sunni Arabs in order to change the demographics in places like Afrin, places that are dear to our Kurdish allies. I'm concerned about security degradation. I'm concerned about ISIS retaking territory. This looks like a win for Assad. This looks like a win for Russia, for Iran, and for ISIS. And it's definitely a win for a NATO ally, Turkey. But our NATO ally is getting ready to move into northern Syria to punish a U.S. ally, regardless of the threats from Germany, the EU, and France, not to attack the YPG.
All right, and we have heard concerns expressed. We've heard concerns expressed from Paris here, that saying that they don't want to see a Turkish invasion. Annick Cizel, the French saying it's because they don't want, most notably, their main concern is about ISIS. They're saying detained terrorist combatants, including those that are foreign nationals, must be tried where their crimes were committed. Before I ask you about this, let's listen to what the Germans have to say. Their government spokesperson taking very seriously this plan for a new Turkish invasion.
Such military intervention will lead to a further escalation in Syria and contribute to a continued destabilization of the country. It would, of course, also have devastating consequences in terms of security politics and humanitarian issues.
How far is this going to go?
What is the most worrying, I think, in terms of transatlantic relations right now is that one of the presidential tweets, Donald Trump's tweets, was seemingly displacing the blame on the European Union and notably France, because we won't take the ISIS prisoners in our country, and he refuses for US taxpayers, so he says, to take on the burden. Now he is delegating that burden to Turkey to take over the ISIS prisoners in the northeastern zone of Syria and letting Turkey do the dirty job, basically. Because we, the European Union, and notably France, Germany, refuse to take over our citizens. This is what was in a White House President Trump tweet. Now, this is really not just displacing the blame, but really trying to shield his own personal decision, which, as the news keeps coming in, it seems really that he's made the decision against the Pentagon's best judgment, most definitely against your previous interviewee was saying the State Department, definitely not Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, but probably the Foreign Service career officers who cannot understand what is taking place right now, making this decision against his best allies, meaning the NATO allies except for Turkey, in the sense that...
But have the French and the Germans, do they factor it all in? They know Donald Trump may send out a tweet after a phone call with the Turkish president, but maybe later it'll all come back to normal?
I'm a little afraid this time it's really going too far. First of all, because US troops have been going down in Syria. I mean, the latest number I was checking today was saying down to 2,000 troops, which is really not so much. It seems, what is worrying as well is that it seems that the President of the United States is following the events. The news came out first from Turkey. It came out from the Kurds in Syria. It came out from Recep Tayyip Erdogan. It seems that the White House is following a political roadmap rather than the military roadmap, which we should be talking about right now, in the wake of Secretary of State Pompeo's trip to Europe, which ended in Greece the past few days, where he renewed, for the second year in a row, a strategic dialogue with the 3+1, the three being Greece, Israel, and Cyprus, and the United States. I've been looking the entire day, why now? Why today? What's in the bargain? What's the win situation for Turkey going in now and knowing the United States is not going to say anything? Well, it seems that the answer lies with the State Department, at least with the Secretary of State right now.
Well, something must have happened during that phone call between Donald Trump and Recep Tayyip Erdogan. There's an invitation to visit the White House in the coming weeks. What's happened?
I think that the context is that Donald Trump indeed doesn't like endless wars, and this might be the only point, the pertinent point of this decision. The problem with this decision is that because you don't like endless war, you take a decision which has massive consequences. And like Michael said, all the enemies, all the concurrents, and against also its own allies, the interest, this decision is strategically inept, if I may say. I mean, it's problematic. And you're right, he's following President Erdogan push. President Erdogan is pushing for this intervention on the eastern side of the Euphrates River since a very long time. I actually worked a lot on different interventions of Turkey everywhere, in Syria and in Iraq. And they always try to get some operations there. And since a couple of years, actually, we see President Erdogan, since Operation Euphrates Shield, is trying to get there. He went to Afrin and is repeatedly going there and until now, the NATO allies always resisted his aim. And this time, President Trump
wasn't there kind of,
decided
we
that
could
it
call
was
up a
not the
map
case.
on this. Wasn't there kind of a quid pro quo that whether you're east or west of the Euphrates River, it was more or less going to be whether or not Turkey's presence in northern Syria was tolerated by NATO?
No, I don't think so. I think that President Erdogan took a kind of bet that he accepted to push the TSK, the Turkish army forces, inside Syria with common patrols with the US. But actually, it was said in the report. But I'm not completely sure that the Turkish forces will stop in the safe zone. For instance, we spoke about the possibility for Turkey to hand over the ISIS fighters. But they are in camps after this safe zone. So you see on the map that actually they might actually go forward after the safe zone and try to conquer more. The President Erdogan never said that he would stop on the safe zone, right?
And your thoughts on this proposed buffer zone? Explain that for us.
Well, the current move is actually the pure is a pure absurdity with the buffer zone, because the buffer zone was accepted a few days ago, and the common patrols started, common American and Turkish patrols started in this zone, and now the US pulled back. For what reason was it necessary to endorse such a safe zone then?
Talha Koza, maybe you can explain for us. What do you make of it all?
I think the terms are wrong. I mean, how we define these ideas are defined in a wrong way. I mean, President Erdogan outlined his idea of peace corridor clearly in his UN General Assembly talk. So he actually reached an agreement with President Trump in November 2018 about establishing a safe zone. The idea of safe zone have been talked during the Obama administration and many times. So the idea and the plan is to withdraw YPG forces 32 kilometers from the Turkish border, established settlements in those areas, and allow the refugees from Turkey and Europe to this area. So one obstacle for Turkey is the presence of the YPG, and the YPG in itself does not necessarily represent the entire Kurds in the area. So they have been made an actor by US to fight against the ISIS, but the US forces have promised to take back the weapons that they provided after the fight against the ISIS. So the overall idea is to create safe zone in that area, let YPG out of that area, resettle the people who escaped from those places, both from the Assad forces and from the YPG, from their pressures, and secure the area and rebuild the area. So that's the idea. So it's portrayed that Turkish forces are gonna invade. Yes, Turkish forces will be there to secure the area, but if the YPG forces, goes out of this area, I think there will not be any fight. So that's the main deal. So Turkey
Right. So
expected not.
You're not surprised then by this announcement? Are you surprised that that Recep Tayyip Erdogan's now invited to the White House after the threat of sanctions over the purchase of that Russian military hardware?
Actually, I'm not surprised because this deal was done a year ago. So the Pentagon, some of the actors in Washington, D.C. resisted this. So Turkey really clarified the plans, how to rebuild that area. And, that's clear. And Erdogan also explained that the reason why Turkey purchased those equipment was because Americans did not provide those weapons. So that was the only idea. So if you provide the Patriot missiles, we are willing to purchase these weapons.
All right, I want to get the reaction of the rest of our panel, but we have to take a quick break, unfortunately. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're making sense of Donald Trump's surprise decision to pull support for Syrian Kurds and effectively, perhaps, opening the way for Turkey to launch an operation, an invasion, if you will, across the border in northern Syria. We're talking about it with a former U.S. intelligence advisor to Iraqi Kurdish forces, Michael Pregent, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute think tank. Thanks for joining us again from Washington. Thank you to Talha Köse, associate professor at Ibn Khaldun University, for being with us from Istanbul. Here in the studio, we're with Annick Cizel, senior lecturer at the Paris's Sorbonne Nouvelle University, and Julien Thérault, who lectures at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Michael Pregent, Donald Trump's current envoy in fighting ISIS, his predecessor has put out quite a scathing tweet saying that Donald Trump's no commander-in-chief, Tom McGurk adding in that tweet that he makes impulsive decisions with no knowledge or deliberation. He sends military personnel into harm's way with no backing. He blusters and then leaves our allies exposed when adversaries call his bluff, or he confronts a hard phone call. No commander-in-chief. I know that the word impeachment's on a lot of people's lips where you are. Are you in favor of removing the president of the United States?
No, I'm in favor of elections. I think elections should remove presidents. If the president actually breaks the law, then that's a different case. But here, this is bipartisan criticism of what the president has done with regards to northern Syria. So that's good news for those of us in D.C. It's a bipartisan, basically reaction, a negative one, to what the president is doing in northern Syria. But let's remember who McGurk is. McGurk is the individual that told our Kurdish allies not to do the referendum after telling them that he would support the referendum years earlier. He was the one that actually was working with the YPG, but told them, your brothers and sisters west of the Euphrates are targets, and there's nothing we're going to do about that. But the YPG forces east of the Euphrates will protect them. Well, you can't have a U.S. policy west of the Euphrates and one east of the Euphrates, and that was a policy that he actually supported. So when he says he resigned over what Trump was doing in Syria, Mattis resigned, and McGurk was already on his way out and simply got on the bandwagon using this excuse that he was somehow principled in resigning from what he actually helped create in northern Syria. He was against pushing back against Assad. He was against creating a Sunni force to go against ISIS. He was a champion of the YPG, which is, even YPG members didn't trust Brett McGurk, because at the same time, he was a champion of the Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq. So while Brett's right that the president should not be leaving northern Syria, there's a lot that Brett was wrong about that a lot of us remember.
And do you agree with Talha Koza that this announcement late Sunday by Donald Trump should not be viewed as a surprise in view of the speech given by Recep Tayyip Erdogan at the UN?
Actually,
well, that's the thing, is Americans aren't paying attention to what
earlier,
Erdogan's saying. They're paying attention to what Trump's saying.
I mean, President Trump has earlier criticized Obama administration's policies with regard to Syria. So aligning U.S. together with terrorist organizations like PKK, YPG was a big mistake. This was a mistake during the Obama administration. And he decided to change this policy, aligning the NATO allies and more dependable actors on the field. So he decided not to continue this policy. That's why those people resigned and resisted this idea. So I think there is consistency in Trump's policies in main line of the argument. However,
Michael
those
Predgen,
actors
let me get your reaction to what Talha just said.
Well, I mean, Talha knows how you get this president to do something. You flatter him if you want him to do what he's doing. You insult him if you want him to stop. So this is a strategy that the president has put in place that doesn't make any sense. This isn't a tilt towards a NATO ally to help us defeat ISIS or hold territory clear of ISIS. This is a green light to a NATO ally to move into northern Syria to go against a U.S. ally. And the president today says, whoa, that's not what I was doing. If they go against the U.S. ally in the YPG, we'll take action. What did the president think a Turkish military operation to exterminate terrorists meant? It didn't mean go after Jabhat al-Nusra. It didn't mean go after ISIS. It meant go after a U.S. ally.
All right. This involvement of the United States with helping the Kurds, it doesn't date back from yesterday. We remember, of course, in neighboring Iraq, there was that no-fly zone imposed against Saddam Hussein in the early 1990s. It was, though, the emergence of ISIS that brought U.S. forces to work in Syria. Sanam Chantier has more on that.
Syria's Kurds are a distinct group, and they have inhabited lands close to the Turkish and Iraqi borders for decades. And large numbers of them have been subjected to systematic discrimination. Now, one of their main factions, the Democratic Union Party, the PYD, began to establish a foothold in the north of the country in the early stages of the Syrian conflict, which started in 2011. This as Bashar al-Assad's forces withdrew to battle the anti-government uprising elsewhere. An affiliated militia, the People's Protections Unit, the YPG, then secured the region. Their control was concentrated in three predominantly Kurdish regions, home to roughly 2 million Kurds. They were Qamishli, Kobani and Afrin, all in the north of the country. And so Kurdish-led governing bodies were set up in those areas and Syrian flags were replaced with their own. At the time, the group opted to stay in the shadows, neither fighting nor supporting Assad's regime. Instead, they were trying to defend and expand their own territory. The area of YPG influence continued to grow, especially as the fighters joined the US-led coalition against the Islamic State group, becoming the spearhead of the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. SDF influence widened to Manbij and Raqqa, and by 2017, the Islamist militants were defeated in both cities. Their biggest victory was in 2014 in Kobani, which raised some concerns for the Turkish authorities. Ankara feared that Syrian Kurds on their southern border were and continue to gain too much de facto autonomy.
No Daesh, no Daesh.
In the US, however, the group had found a reliable partner, but that is now under question. Since early August, the US and Turkey have been working together on a series of confidence-building measures in a 75-mile-long strip of that 300-mile border area. American-backed Kurdish forces, for their part, have pulled back several miles and destroyed fortifications in that region.
So you heard Julien Théron, Michael Pregent described the Syrian Kurds as allies. You heard Talha Köse talk of them as terrorists because of their support for the PKK insurgency inside of Turkey. Going forward now, what's going to happen with or without?
I have to recall something first. ISIS is not defeated. We say that in Iraq, we say that in Syria, but it's not defeated. It just went into clandestinity. They are
in hiding.
ISIS, yes, and go up to attack. There are attacks every day in Syria and in Iraq. So they are not defeated at all. And we have to pay attention to that because ISIS, when it was already still Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they just popped up again because of chaotic situation that actually we are more or less creating now. Second element, retracting our support to the Kurds is letting a well-structured network of militia, well-armed, that might be actually acting against the US interest now if they are just let down in favor of Turkey. Meaning, what does it mean? It means creating perhaps another enemy when favoring already all the enemies on the ground. And the third element, what we are saying because of Donald Trump's decision, is just the summit of the lack of coherent strategy in US strategy in the Middle East. Look a little bit. After the Gulf War, we encouraged the Kurds and the Shia in Iraq to protest against Saddam Hussein, and we've let them down. Then we imposed in Iraq a blocus, thinking
blockade.
Thinking that they would love us for that. Then the US decided to attack and invade Iraq against international law, and of course it created the collapse that we think. Then, so it was George W. Bush. Then Barack Obama has been elected and said, like, I will retract the troops when at the very moment where the situation was being stabilized in Iraq. So we retracted the troop because he wanted a nuclear deal with Iran. Iran stepped in and ISIS arrived. We didn't back the Syrian revolution either. Then actually Donald Trump has been elected and said, like, retract from the Iran deal. So we have everything. We have militias backing Iran. We have a strong Iran. We don't have a nuclear deal anymore. We have collapse of Syria. We have Bashar al-Assad. We have also ISIS. And now we're creating potential new enemies.
But as you said in part one of our discussion, Julien, the Donald Trump is onto something politically here, which is people in the United States, they're sick of being in this area. And you just described how they've been there since 2003 and even before.
Yes, but you have to act thinly because of these situations. You can't just make big moves, which are a retraction of what you did just before, because otherwise you'll have a complete nasty effect.
All right, and the French and the Germans, who have come in for a lot of heat, as you were describing in part one of our discussion, and he said, what should they do?
Well, I believe the first reaction we've heard today was that of the United Nations, and not trying to go unilaterally like the United States is going right now, but trying to speak with one voice. The European Union, the United Nations, the warning was chilly actually on the part of the United Nations. immediately imagining that the Turks are pretty much going to be doing in northeastern Syria what the Saudis have been doing in Yemen. That basically the same humanitarian tragedy could occur again and again on these regions, which have been at war for too many years now. That it seems from the emergency reaction and strong wording of the UN that diplomacy has that all like the emergency lines of communication, I was going like red phone back in the Cold War. The emergency lines of communication have all broken down at the same time. And that the United Nations could not do anything but say, please restraint. Please don't go, as if it's taken for granted that nothing can roll back what is taking place.
Let me ask Talha Kuz about this. Now that the lines have been reestablished directly between Turkey and its president and the US president, does it mean that Recep Tayyip Erdogan doesn't have to pay attention or care about what the UN says, what France says, what Germany says?
No, Turkey cares about all these actors, and Turkey's policies, actually, plans are quite transparent. So Turkey communicated its plan to establish the safe zone to all its actors during Erdogan's UN visit. So there is nothing, unclear about this issue. Turkey's objectives are clear. He clearly outlined that we are committed to territorial unity of Syria. PKK, YPG are terrorist organizations. We want them to outside of our border lines. So this is not an invasion. And if PKK, YPG withdraws from these regions, there will not be bloodshed. So I think, dramatizing the issue in such a way, it's like the invasion, killing the Kurds, does not really represent the entire truth. So if in a coordinated way, YPG withdraws from these regions and Turkey starts its policy of resettling the refugees and re-establishing the towns in that area, this will create stability in that region. That's the whole idea behind Erdogan. Of course, it's very difficult. It will be very difficult without the coordination of the European actors. So Turkey is also planning to coordinate this with the participation of European actors. Turkey doesn't want to lose Germany, UK, and even France in this issue. So I think UN is also a very important actor, and UN is willing to coordinate this effort with Turkey.
Let's listen to the tone of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He was speaking this Monday about what to do about the foreign fighters held in Kurdish prisons, as well as their families in refugee camps.
Yeah,
As you know, there are IS group members in the region from different countries, like Germany and France. Those countries now say, we want to let go of control. We cannot look after them anymore. That's enough. They will work on what can be done on this issue. In the meantime, we have also given orders to our officials. They are also doing some work on what sort of steps should be taken to get rid of the IS members in prison.
Michael Prechin, whose job is it to detain and try captured ISIS fighters?
Well, if you listen to Brett McGurk, he said that all ISIS fighters should die in Iraq or Syria. And then he recommended that Baghdad be the responsible government to try all captive ISIS fighters, whether they be in the Syrian theater of operation or in Iraq. And that has led to a bunch of people that were simply labeled ISIS collaborators to be executed.
All right, but what does Michael Prechin think?
I don't think Erdogan's going to put ISIS fighters in prison. I think he's going to, unfortunately, I think he's going to let them go in order to destabilize other parts of Syria, and we're going to have security degradation. I don't see him, he hasn't done it with Jabhat al-Nusra. Turkish forces never took on ISIS. They took on the YPG. And this military operation is to resettle Sunni Arabs, and they should be resettled, but they should be resettled into Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, not necessarily Kobani, not necessarily Afrin. But this is a move to change the demographics in the north that favors Turkey, and to push these ISIS fighters and others into areas so they can deal with Russia, Iran, and the Iranian militias. This is security degradation. I hope I'm wrong. It'd be great to see Erdogan roll all these ISIS fighters up and have public trials in Turkey where they're actually committed to prison sentences or death based on their actions. But to simply roll up people and call them collaborators like Iraq has done is not the answer.
And what's your prediction as to what's going to happen, briefly?
Security degradation. The president, this is a terrible situation for President Trump, because ahead of a 2020 election, he's going to give resurgence to ISIS. Like the other panelists said, ISIS is alive and well in Iraq and Syria, and the last thing the president wants to deal with is security degradation ahead of a 2020 election, something he criticized President Obama for in 2008, 2009, ahead of the 2012 elections.
Talha Kuzu, you agree?
Ahead of security backslide and ISIS coming in.
I completely disagree with comments of Michael President. Turkey effectively fought against ISIS from Elbap, killed more than 3,500 ISIS militants, pushed them out of the place, and effectively fighting during the borders. And this does not necessarily represent what's going on in the field. So Turkey took responsibility to deal with the ISIS in that part of the region. So, of course, fighting ISIS is not responsibility of just Turkey. And also some of the European officials celebrated Turkey about Turkey's effort to deal with the ISIS. Even within Turkey, within its borders, Turkey is fighting against ISIS, taking good intelligence operations and trying to constrain, catching some of the important ISIS officials in Turkey and other parts.
Anik Sizel, let me ask you, because time's running short. This Turkey and NATO member, as you reminded us in part one of our discussion, we've been saying throughout since Donald Trump's been elected, is this one of those critical moments that's going to test whether or not NATO has a future?
Most definitely, Turkey has reminded President Trump that it is a member of NATO. It's also reminded President Trump that he is a strategic dialogue partner of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well. It's also reminded President Trump that it's part of the Astana peace process over Syria, together with Russia and Iran, that the big player in the region right now is not the United States. The big players in the region, the US is not one of the big players, and Turkey definitely is this Eurasian pivot in the region, which is reasserting right now this regional leadership role that the Syrian conflict has enabled it to push upward again. So most definitely, Turkey is leading the game right now, has potentially, I don't know, place in the balance we are not going to buy further armament from Russia. We are going to turn back to the United States if the United States lets us do this. And by the way, not any time in Israeli politics, at the time when we are in the interim, no government really in Israel. So at the time when really President Trump wants to win a war, he started believing his own fake news that ISIS has been defeated. And this is what the White House press secretary was telling the whole wide world last night, that ISIS is defeated, which it's not. That definitely Turkey is going to be a peace builder in northeastern Syria, which is not the nationalist security drive for Turkey stepping in without the United States today. So most definitely, it seems the White House is believing its own fake news at this stage and acting up on it.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Anik Sizel, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Julien Théron, Michael Prejean for being with us from Washington, Talha Kuzu in Istanbul. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there. Yes, this is quite a tangled web. Lots of people talking about it online, unsurprisingly. And of course, the tweets of Donald Trump are getting huge amounts of attention. He has tweeted quite prolifically on the issue. One of them says, "It is time for us to get out of these ridiculous, endless wars, many of them tribal, and bring our soldiers home. We will fight where it is to our benefit and only fight to win." Essentially, America first means we don't mind dumping our allies, is how a lot of people are basically interpreting that particular tweet and the message that we got from the statement that came out on Sunday night. There are fears, of course, that this could leave the Kurds extremely vulnerable if Turkey were to invade Syria. And Donald Trump has today reacted to all of the criticism, because there has been a lot of it out there, not just from sort of Twitter, fans of Twitter behind their little keyboards. It's political people, political heavyweights getting involved here. What he's tweeted today is, "If Turkey does anything that I, in my great and unmatched wisdom, consider to be off limits, I will totally destroy and obliterate the economy of Turkey. I've done before." I'm not quite sure what he means by having destroyed Turkey's economy before. But yes, he believes he has great and unmatched wisdom, and that he alone can keep Turkey under control. Looking at some of the reactions to this, the Daily Beast, Michael Weiss says that the White House announcement was slightly less bombastic than those tweets we saw from Donald Trump, but he describes it as reading as if it were written by someone who wants absolutely nothing to do with a part of a world as messed up as the Middle East and doesn't care if the whole place burns to the ground, which is a really damning criticism. The criticisms are coming from far and wide. This woman is a journalist in Kurdistan. She knows all about the PKK. She's written a book about them. And she is very, very concerned about what will happen next. Get ready for absolute tragedy, she says. "I can't begin to list the possible consequences. They are all tragic." But a lot of the criticisms are coming from those that you would expect to be on the side of Donald Trump. This particular presenter on Fox and Friends, Brian Kilmeade, said, "What kind of message is that to the next ally that wants to side with us? All we did is arm them and they did all the work. Now we say good luck surviving disaster." Now, the other two hosts try to put the president's side of events, but when you've got Fox and Friends turning on him, he must be getting a little nervous, and perhaps that's why he's now qualifying some of his comments with further tweets today. Lindsey Graham, of course, Republican senator, is really leading the charge on this one, saying that by abandoning the Kurds, we sent the most dangerous signal possible. America is an unreliable ally, and it's just a matter of time before he thinks China, Russia, Iran and North Korea will act out in dangerous ways. Now, he is leading the charge to ensure that if Turkey does anything, it gets kicked out of NATO. So there are steps being taken to try to guard against the possible worst results of this. Nikki Haley, the former US ambassador to the UN, says we must always have the backs of our allies if we expect them to have our back. The Kurds were instrumental in our successful fight against ISIS in Syria. Donald Trump always seems to talk about it as though it was the Americans alone who triumphed over ISIS. But of course, they cannot be forgotten. And note the hashtag here, hashtag Turkey is not our friend.
Wow.
Yes, strong words there. Now, Brett McGurk has been mentioned already on the show tonight, the special presidential envoy for the global coalition to counter ISIS. He has been tweeting, quite prolifically. I think it probably matches Donald Trump's number of tweets. But he says that basically, it's worth remembering that he resigned because Trump had originally threatened to pull out of Syria. But he says that there's a fundamental lack of understanding of anything happening on the ground. The US aren't even holding any prisoners, which is one of the things that the statement claimed. He says Donald Trump is not a commander-in-chief. He makes impulsive decisions with no knowledge or deliberation. He sends military personnel into harm's way with no backing. He blusters and then leaves our allies exposed when adversaries call his bluff or he confronts a hard phone call. So very, very strong words being used indeed. And it'll be interesting to see if Donald Trump can back down or mitigate it, or if he's going to take on all these critics.
All right, many thanks for that, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.